Okay, this thing is recording now. So, alright, I get going. Hello guys, my name is Josue Diaz. I am a licensed architect in the state of California, New York, and Hawaii. And in today's lesson, or episode I should say, I'm going to be talking with you guys about accessible millwork or casework. I got a recent plancha comment that made me do some calculations, and I figured this might be something good to share with you guys. So in this video, I'm going to go over three things. One, what makes a counter accessible. Two, how to calculate the percentage. And third, I'm just going to tell you what my frustrations or comments are about this section and go from there. So here we go. Okay, first, there are a few things that we need to make sure that are met in order for millwork to be accessible. Number one has to do with making sure that if you have handles that they are accessible. So you can't have those little knobs where you have to pinch and pull. So no pinching is allowed. Usually standard U-pulls or pulls that have somewhere where people can grab onto without necessarily pinching. So that's really, in essence, the main thing that makes millwork accessible in terms of operating, because there's really not much operating going on millwork. So make sure that the hardware that is used for the drawers, for the leaves, that they're U-pulls or something similar that does not require twisting or pinching. The second item, and this is what requires usually the calculations, has to do with the heights of your shelving or storage in your cabinetry. Now, you've probably seen this. There's an ambulance going on there. Hopefully everybody's okay. You've seen a diagram similar to this where you are provided with reach ranges. And the reach ranges depend on how deep you're reaching out. And because millwork is usually 24 inches deep, we usually go with this one range that you see here on the screen. Now you'll notice that there is an upper limit of how much you're able to reach up to, and there is also a lower limit to how much or how low you can reach and grab something as well. Having that in mind, I'm going to show you now a typical elevation of cabinetry. In this section, or in this elevation, you're going to see upper cabinets and lower cabinets. Now, just really quickly here, if I draw a line as to where the higher limit and I draw a line as to where the lower limit would be for reach ranges that are accessible, you'll notice right away that practically your upper cabinets are not accessible. So a big surprise, right? But in most instances, upper cabinets are not accessible. And you would assume that the lower cabinets are accessible, and you would be partially right because most of them are, but there's also a lower limit. So the lower shelf is not accessible. So what does that mean for us? Well, let's take a look at the code section that talks about accessible millwork. So here it is, and you will notice that what is required is for accessibility to be provided for 50% of the shelving and storage units, which in this case is our cabinetry storage units. And so going back to the diagram as to whether or not this complies or not, let's highlight the shelving that is not accessible. So I'm going to highlight it with red here. So you'll see that obviously I start with the upper cabinets because they are not accessible. And then I will highlight in green the surfaces that are accessible in the lower cabinets. And you'll notice that I'm able to account for the countertop. The countertop is accessible. Obviously, if there is a stove or a sink or something like that that does not allow for me to use that counter, then that is not accessible. So we cannot use that portion of the countertop. But the other shelving that's underneath it, including drawers, drawers can be accessible. And assuming you only have a single shelf, adjustable shelf, I mean, on the lower cabinets, that adjustable shelf will probably be accessible as long as it's above the reach range. And sadly, the very bottom shelf, that is not accessible. So there we go. So now we have a visual illustration of the accessible cabinets and the non-accessible, the accessible shelving units and the non-accessible shelving units. So now here's where the 50% calculation comes into play. You will notice that in most instances, you are not going to be able to match the width of upper cabinets with your lower cabinets, which we like to do as architects and designers. We usually want to make sure that they are symmetrical. But sadly, when you do the calculation, if you do have the same width like we do here, you will notice that when we take the total linear shelving and then we take the accessible shelving, the math just doesn't work. The math just doesn't allow us because it's over 50%. So what do we have to do? Well, what I have had to do, and this is just one of the solutions that I've had to provide, is that I simply remove some of the upper shelving. Now there's other solutions, of course. I'm not going to go into it because there's just multiple solutions. You can add some shelving that ends up being like floor to ceiling type of shelving, but usually that's not what you want. In any case, in this instance, to make this work, I am going to simply reduce the number of upper cabinets, the linear storage units. And so I end up with something like this here. Now, again, you see my accessible shelving and you see my non-accessible shelving. But this time when I do the calculation, you see that I am meeting the 50%. So at least 50% of my accessibility is met with the shelving that I am showing here. So that is it. Now, when I submit this to the building department, if I have an elevation that has to prove that I am required or that I am meeting the 50%, there it is. There's my elevation and there's my calculation, and it shows that I am meeting the 50%. Now, on to my frustration with this building code section, or just accessible section. It has to do with when it applies. Because if we go back to the code section, we'll notice that the code section applies to kitchens and kitchenettes. Well, you see here the code section. It tells you it's pretty simple. But this is where interpretation comes into place, and sometimes where my frustration comes into place too. Because for the most part, break rooms have not been required, in my experience, to have accessible shelving. Because in my experience, break rooms are not considered to be kitchens or kitchenettes. Now, when you look at the definition of kitchen or kitchenettes, it's often associated with cooking or prepping food. So if a break room has a stove or a range, then you could reasonably come to the conclusion that, hey, okay, you're doing some cooking there, so this would meet the requirements of a kitchen or a kitchenette. So in those instances, I would say, okay, that's fine, I understand. So the millwork is going to have to basically be accessible or meet the requirements of that accessible section that we just looked at. But when my break room does not have a stove or a range, then I think it's debatable. I think it's debatable as to whether or not millwork in a break room is considered to or is required to meet this code section. And I don't know, what have you guys done with this section, or has it even been applied to you? Have you ever had to go through it? Honestly, for me personally, I hope that the banging on the mic doesn't mess things up, but anyways, Personally, I have never, I shouldn't say never, I have not been required to meet this code until recently. And, on one end, I think about it as, you know what, just because I've been doing something a certain way all the time doesn't mean it's right. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that just because I haven't done it, because I know people that are like, well, I've been doing this for 20 years or whatever, and I never had to do that. I don't buy into that either, because just because you've been doing something one way for a very long time, it doesn't mean that it's right. It just means that you haven't gotten caught, right? So I don't necessarily think that just because I've done it forever means that it's right. However, it has just been implemented where I live, and I read the code. I'm like, okay, there's reasonableness into it, and I want to comply with it as a good architect. But just in locations where it's been required that I don't agree with, like I just don't agree that certain break rooms should be considered kitchens or kitchenettes. And in the end, I think that most of the time, I'm sure like you guys, we as architects and interior designers or people in this industry, we not only have to meet building codes, but we also have to meet timelines, we have to meet budgets, we have to meet expectations. And honestly, sometimes it's easier to just give the plan checker what they want rather than arguing with them about it. Now, not that we argue, or I don't necessarily argue with them, but you get my point. You get what I'm trying to say, right? And if you're a plan checker, you know how it goes. I mean, I'm not trying to say that we argue with you all the time. I'm just saying that's just the nature of things. Sometimes we have to get on the phone and discuss things, and that's what I usually do. I try to get on the phone and just discuss this and see if there's reasonableness into it. But sometimes I don't know. Sometimes I figure the time and effort that goes into getting this approved, depending on the plan checker, is just not worth the time that it's going to delay my project. Because I don't know about you guys, but as an architect, my projects are usually all due yesterday or 2 weeks ago. I'm always trying to catch up. Well, not always, but you get what I'm saying. So what do you guys think? Is this something that you guys face a lot? Is this something that you guys have had to argue or, discuss with the jurisdictions? Maybe I shouldn't use the word argue, but again, you get what I'm saying. I'm not trying to make this a big argument, but if you have, I'd be interested to know how you've dealt with it in your jurisdiction, or I would also be curious to know if they've even mentioned anything in your jurisdiction. But anyways, that's it. That's my frustration with it. I hope you liked this video. I hope that now if you ever get a plan check comment that comes back asking you to provide accessible millwork, at least now you know what it means, you know how to make it work, and you know how to provide the calculations. So hopefully it'll be of some real life use to you. If you liked the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help. You can share with other people that you think would like this type of information, people that might work in the industry. And if you're really feeling generous, like some other people are helping me with this, please leave me become a subscriber in Patreon and be one of my patrons. Or if you just want to give me a one-time donation, that's fine too. You can just buy me a coffee. All the information to those accounts are in my video description below. But I'd appreciate anything you can do, whether it just be something free like liking, subscribing, and sharing, or if you feel generous, that will be awesome. I love it. Thank you guys. Until next time, this is Archie Corner signing out.